Two balls and a strike to count on Taylor. Reyes fires, swinging a drive, deep left field. This is one back. Walk the ball. Let's Taylor.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today by managing editor Matthew Moreno. Matt, we've got a press conference to discuss today. Andrew Friedman did his annual after-the-season press conference last week. Obviously, as he said, we were hoping we wouldn't be talking about this today, but here we are. So before we dive into some of the nitty-gritty and some of the specific quotes, which we'll discuss here, I'm curious just your overall thoughts and reactions to his press conference, to what he said. And we should mention, GM Brandon Gomes was up there. It was only, I don't think, asked a single question. He answered one, but we're going to focus on Friedman here. So what was your overall reaction to what he said and how he said it?
It was a little bit of it. I expected a lot of what he sort of said. We've seen it in the past. It wasn't much of a surprise, but I think the biggest takeaway that I had was how, I don't know what the right word, like combative, almost like agitated, maybe a little testy he got, specifically when asked about, is Dave Roberts making, these in-game decisions? Just because he's usually not like that. He's very poised and polished and willing to answer the same question, 5 different times. And even before that point, with one of the exchanges, he was kind of answering it. And then, he got to a point where he said, look, again, I already answered this for you. Like, it was that kind of stuff that shocked me.
Yeah, what's funny about these is I always look forward to them as if I'm going to hear something, like as if he's going to give me a nugget that I didn't know. And then I watch it and I'm like, he just does such a good job of not answering the questions that you want him to answer. There's a lot of questions about, is Justin Turner and Cody Bellinger coming back? And he, I'm not going to answer that question. And he does a really good job, but my reaction was the same as yours. I wasn't used to that. It felt like you said, there were 2 exchanges. One where he felt like a reporter was asking him the exact same question 4 different times after he answered it. And he basically said, like you just hinted at, like, hey, I've already answered that. Like, I can say this again to you. And then the same thing, when he was asked about who makes decisions, as we'll get into, was it Dave Roberts or someone else? And he said, I answer this question every single year. It's Dave Roberts. So do you think that was just a product of frustration because they lost? Like, I mean, that seems like the obvious answer, right? Or do you think there's more to it than that?
I think with the Dave Roberts one specifically, that is just more because he even said, like, I've answered this multiple times, basically every year that the Dodgers have lost. Like, that's a question. I've answered it every single time. I think if you want to take a step back and just look at everything, there probably was frustration and disappointment. I mean, he sat there and admitted that, Sunday after the day they were eliminated, that he felt terrible and that he still, was feeling down and upset and frustrated. So, and that's understandable, right? Like, I'm not sitting here saying, hey, he shouldn't have shown any emotion up there. It's just, like I said, more than anything, I was surprised to see that from him. And, I think it's Dodger fans should be encouraged if Andrew Friedman is up there upset and disappointed, because I think the perception is that the front office and ownership group is, just fine with everything kind of going as it's been. And that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's helpful for us to remind ourselves that A, these guys are humans, and B, like, you could argue very easily that they are far more invested in the success of this team than you and I are. Like, as much as it hurts me to watch the Dodgers lose, imagine being the guy who not only built the team, like, it's like your child that is out there either succeeding or failing, but also for a lot of these people, now Andrew Friedman has incredible job security, but like their livelihood, their job, their reputation is at stake. Like, my job, my reputation, my livelihood were not at stake when the Dodgers lost. And so I think in some ways, I'm not saying all of this was planned, but I wonder if it was actually a good move for him to be a little bit testy in this press conference, to be like, hey, you know what? Like, yeah, you guys are pissed, so am I. Like, we're pissed too. We're equally as frustrated as you are. And I just think that reminded me, and hopefully some other folks, I'm guessing, like, oh yeah, okay. Like, I don't have to pretend like Andrew Friedman and Dave Roberts, Justin Turner, all these guys, like, none of them care as much as I do. They care more than you. I guarantee every single person involved cares more than you. As far as kind of the content of what he said, let's go through maybe 3 or 4 of the things that when I listened sort of jumped out at me. And the first was sort of what I would consider like to be his opening remarks, which was essentially a rhetorical question in which he said, was this just baseball that the Dodgers lost or something they could have improved? This was in response to him mentioning, hey, we were the best team in the regular season in every metric when it came to hitting with runners in scoring position. And then we go for an 0 for 19 stretch right in the middle of this one. And so he's asking, is this just baseball? Is this just something that happens in this sport that you can't control? Or was this something that we could have improved, something we could have done better? He goes on to say throughout the press conference, like, I'm not totally sure yet what the answer to that question was. He hinted at, hey, even though we were the best in the regular season, there were peaks and there were valleys. This just happened to be a valley at a really poor time. I'm curious for you, Matt. This is a rhetorical question he didn't answer. You and I are not Andrew Friedman, and I would venture to say, no offense to, with all due respect to you, Matt, Andrew Friedman probably slightly smarter than the two of us here. But do you have thoughts? Like, was this just a fluky thing, or was there something that, as you've reflected on it, you're like, man, if only they had done blank?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just horrible timing for basically, several key contributors to go into a slump. I mean, I know if you want to really dig into the numbers, you can trace it back to, a little bit in September, depending on when you pick end and start dates for things, right? Like, I think statistics can be manipulated sort of however you want. It was a short series, not quite the best of 3, like with the wild card series, but a best of 5. Anything can kind of happen. And I think that's sort of what we saw. Like the Dodgers, had it been a best of 7 series, maybe they come back from another 3-1 deficit, excuse me, just because their depth, kind of plays a part. Maybe their hitters finally get on track. But a best of 5, if it sort of only takes one game to go against you to where you can then kind of, you end up behind the 8 ball all of a sudden. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to agree with him. And I know fans don't necessarily want to hear that explanation because it's the Dodgers had X, Y, and Z talent, and I 100% agree. Like this, if you had asked me why would the Dodgers lose in the postseason, the lineup struggling the way it did would not have been near the top. I would have thought, maybe the starters don't necessarily do well. Maybe the bullpen sort of struggles. And I don't know if you could say the bullpen struggled, but we saw them not be perfect, which is what they had been. And to hold them to that expectation isn't fair. But yeah, I mean, I think Friedman does have a point that, we've seen it time and time again. You brought it up in some of our recent videos, like the postseason is unpredictable.
Yeah. And I know a lot of LA people, maybe not huge Bill Simmons fans, but I was listening to his podcast earlier this week, and he obviously is a Boston guy, so he's not invested in the Dodgers' success, but he's like, what a stupid sport that like the Mets, Braves, and Dodgers have all been sent home. Like he basically said, there's got to be something where a team that wins 111 games has to have some sort of an advantage. Like there has to be more of an advantage. And he went on to throw out a bunch of ideas. Like, do they just host all 5 games? He suggested something a lot of people have mentioned. Should the first 2 games have been in San Diego so that the Padres had no chance of clinching at home? Then the Dodgers would have games 3, 4, and 5, which I've seen some people mention, something along those lines. But to me, I mean, Friedman even went into it a little bit. He said, look, game 2, we were hitting the ball really, really hard. It was just right at Machado or whatever. He said games 3 and 4, it wasn't as great. But he also referenced the sac fly that Will Smith hit. And he's basically like, that ball gets hit 100 miles an hour. And if it's 6 feet to the left or 6 feet to the right, it's a 3-run double. In this game, we're not even having this conversation right now. And so I tend to believe it was just baseball. And we've mentioned this before. I dug into the 0 for 19. Every single guy in the lineup that had an at-bat other than Max Muncy was at least 0 for 1. Like, it wasn't just like, oh, they just had the wrong guys up, or like, oh, Cody Bellinger has a terrible approach in that spot. It's the guys who have great approaches. Like my guy, Will Smith, who has been unbelievable in those situations, never seems rattled. He was 0 for 2. Freeman was 0 for 2. Trey was 0 for 2. Mookie was 0 for 2. Like, every single guy. So, to say that it was like, oh, it was a bad approach, like, you're telling me every hitter in the Dodgers lineup had the wrong approach? No, it was just bad luck and unfortunate timing, and that's the nature of the baseball playoffs. And so I liked the way he put it, because I also thought, I just like the nuance that he allows in these things. Like, even when somebody asked him about analytics, he's like, analytics is just putting yourself in the best position to succeed and evaluating pitchers and hitters and situations. Like, it's not some boogeyman. And sometimes, like I keep saying, if something is supposed to happen 60% of the time, if I place a bet on it there's still a 4 out of 10 chance I lose. It doesn't mean I made the wrong bet. The Dodgers did not do the wrong thing just because they lost. Sometimes things don't go in your favor. And that leads to the second quote that I thought was interesting for him, which is he said, the best team doesn't win in Major League Baseball. The hottest team does. Now, Matt, I love this, first of all, because I've been saying the best team does not always win for like a decade. So I appreciate to hear somebody else voice this. Not that I'm unique in that. But I think it's interesting to hear a guy whose job is to construct a roster say, there's only so much I could do, because he seemed pretty clear we had the best roster. We had the best bullpen. I think at one point they said this was the best pitching staff 1 through 13 we've ever had. I think you can make a pretty compelling argument it was the best lineup they've ever had. We felt better about the bench bats this year than we did last year, although this year they didn't turn out to be a whole lot better. So like, this seems pretty straightforward to me. Fans don't want to hear it because hottest team is impossible to plan for and impossible to quantify, but I agree with him.
Yeah, definitely. And what's interesting is, getting hot, like there's no blueprint to, getting hot, right, for the postseason. Because if we look at, like I referenced a few days ago, in 2017, the Dodgers clinched the division and then went on like a horrible stretch. Like they were 1 and something. I think they lost 11 or 12 games in a row. Everybody was panicking because then also in the NLDS, their opponent was going to be the Diamondbacks, who had done well against them during the season. And the Dodgers tore their way through the playoffs into the World Series. We know what happened, and, had the whole cheating scandal thing not taken place. They have another championship, and maybe, the conversation around the 2022 season isn't so intense.
Yeah.
So, and fans point to, the Padres had to play for everything they had. But if you look at like the last 10 games, even the last 20 games for the Padres, the Dodgers, the Phillies, the Dodgers had better records.
Yeah.
So it's like they didn't decide to, hey, we're going to mail it in. We have nothing to play for. Wake us up in October. Like that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
They were still playing the games in front of them. And frankly, that final 6-game series against the Rockies, I'm sure there were a few fans who were saying, hey, you guys need to have more intensity for this. I wasn't one of them. I don't think that would have made a difference either. At that point, the most important thing was getting through those games healthy, because we saw last year what happens. And so, guess what? If you want these guys to go 110% against the Rockies and they get hurt, they may end up getting swept in the NLDS. Then what? Like, would you have been happy if that was the case? So it's a lot of revisionist history. And, to circle back to the question specifically, I do agree. Like, the best baseball team, I think, can get hot at the right time, but it doesn't always happen. And we've seen that time and time again.
Yeah, I had people saying, oh, this team mailed it in from the middle of September. I'm like, well, guess what? Google is your friend. Punch it in. The last 25 games of the season, the Dodgers won 68% of their games. Their win percentage on the season was 68.5. Like, they were one of the best teams, if not the best team in baseball over the last 25 games of the regular season. And people are just looking for reasons. Now, this was the question, I believe, that he got a little irritated at. I could be wrong, but it was a question that was basically like, which I thought was a fair question. I don't know if it needed to be asked 4 different times in 4 different ways, but it was, you guys clearly have figured out how to build a team for the regular season. Is there a different model for building a team for success in the postseason? And his answer seemed to be no. We felt like we had the best team. If you could have given us the opportunity to rebuild a roster, we would have taken that roster, and it just didn't matter. Like, just briefly, do you agree with that mentality, or do you think there is maybe a different roster construction strategy for a postseason team versus a regular season team?
I personally believe that there is a little bit of a different approach that you could kind of had, or maybe even needs. I think the Dodgers obviously have excelled in putting together tremendous depth to get them through the course of a regular season. And I believe that sometimes those back end depth pieces aren't necessarily the difference makers you may end up needing in the postseason. Yeah. And really specifically, if you want to look at the last 2 years, it's been the bench that has kind of hurt them. And, Trace Thompson, obviously, he did great. He also went cold, but he had reverse splits, and that's not necessarily something you can plan for. But in an ideal world, like, he would have hit left-handed pitching the way the Dodgers sort of needed him, because it would have given them a little more flexibility. And another thing too, Friedman alluded to, were the injuries. Like, maybe Chris Taylor doesn't hurt his neck and to interrupt his rhythm, because frankly, like
Lux and Turner too.
And good point. Chris Taylor specifically, he said he was in a good rhythm at the time of the neck injury. he thought he'd be able to, sort of get it back a little bit with the live at bats he was taking before the NLDS. That didn't end up being the case. And so I think that, was a factor. He was kind of, a shell of himself a little bit. Like he just did not look great up there.
Yeah.
So I think that's where, but again, that being said, there's not hey, do X and Y will absolutely happen. I just think that maybe you need to be a little bit more mindful of kind of top end talent, but then that sounds funny because we're talking about a team that had Mookie Betts, Freddie Freeman, Will Smith, like Max, on and on and on. So for me specifically, it lands with, I think if you have really good starting pitching who can go, 6 or 7 innings, I think that ends up sort of being your difference maker potentially.
Yeah.
But even then, we've seen those teams. I mean, look at the Mets.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the point you're making is a really good one, which is to win in the regular season, there's almost a quantity over quality type of thing. Like you need, it's not just about putting together a 5-man rotation and a 9-man lineup, and that's it, and going 14 deep. It's, you need to go 26, 30, 32 deep in the regular season in order to be successful. The Dodgers have done that better than anyone. But what I would argue, and you and I agree on this, is once you come to the postseason, now it's a quality over quantity thing, right? Like I said, Rich Hill was always the perfect picture of this. Like people hated when the Dodgers kept re-signing Rich Hill. They're like, this guy only pitches 110 innings. He only goes 5 or 6. Like, what are we doing? And it's like, yeah, because the Dodgers didn't care about the 110 innings. They knew that if it came down to, if you had one pitcher to pitch a game, Rich Hill was probably one of the 20 or 25 best pitchers in baseball at the time on that day. And that's all they cared about. Like, can he give us a couple postseason starts? The only thing I would push back against, and you're not saying this, but fans who say, hey, we need to construct the roster differently, the Dodgers do quantity and quality literally better than anybody else. Like, if you said, give me the best 14-man roster, it's not like the Dodgers, like, all of a sudden fail because, oh, well, we're so reliant on depth. They have depth, but, like, nobody in baseball is boasting a better 1 through 6 in their lineup than the Dodgers did. Nobody in baseball was boasting a better bullpen than the Dodgers did. And I think you could even make a case of all the postseason teams, and you saw this with the Padres and who they had to go to in the like game 1 as their number 4 starter. I don't know if there's any team in baseball, or at least the Dodgers are in the upper echelon, of like a 1 through 4 starting pitcher rotation. Now, Gonsolin's injury, Dustin May's injury, there were a couple mitigating factors that I think hurt that, but I would argue Gonsolin/Heaney was not the reason they lost this. So I guess I would say they were constructed both to win 111 games in the regular season, and if you could just build a roster for the postseason, like, this is the roster I would have built. I would have said, give me the best 1 through 4 in baseball by a wide margin, and then give me a couple guys after that I trust. Give me the number 2 guy in the Cy Young. Give me, if you go to 120 innings, the Dodgers had number 1, 2, and 3 in starting pitcher ERA. They had the best bullpen in baseball. So I do agree with you that there is a different roster construction for the postseason. I think as Dodger fans, we're sort of lucky that they kind of do both. Like, do you agree with that? Does that make sense for you?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think, again, like, it's all if like, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. But if they were healthy, like if Tony Gonsolin never gets injured and he's, pitching at his normal workload throughout the season, he arguably has a better game 3 performance than what we saw, right? And so maybe then that sort of changes. And like you just said, like, that wasn't really the reason they necessarily lost the game. If Dustin May is healthy, like, who knows, right? But and same thing. If Gavin Lux doesn't get hurt to interrupt his rhythm, like, he was having a very good, the best season of his career. If Justin Turner doesn't get hurt, and but yeah, I mean, and that's why, like, I think there is a different approach and construction for the postseason. You and I agree with that, but I do agree with you. Is the Dodgers do more or less do that? Because then, like, it sounds funny to say, oh, they needed more talent, and then you look at the roster and it's like, well, where, like, they're not going to put an all-star team together, even though they almost, are capable of it, have done it if players perform at their full potential.
Yeah, along those lines, let's go rapid fire a few more. One of the things he said, no regrets, not adding a starting pitcher at the deadline. This is something you and I have debated before, and I would side with him only in the sense of the Dodgers did not lose this series because of their starting pitching. First of all, Urias and Kershaw, both of them were, I think I gave them B- for their performances, 5 innings, 3 earned runs. But even if you add a starter, like, it's not like, oh, well, then Urias or Kershaw doesn't pitch. Tyler Anderson, who was the guy many people wanted to bump, was fantastic. And then Gonsolin and Heaney. Gonsolin struggled. Heaney wasn't perfect. But combined, they kind of gave you I would say an average to above average performance of a starting pitcher. So I agree that starting pitching was not the reason they lost. Therefore, I don't think they should look back and say we should have done something differently, because I don't think it would have adjusted the outcome of the series. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, and honestly, I guess I'll preface all this with I wouldn't expect Friedman to sit up there and say that he regrets not doing anything. I think no matter, even if he does, even if it was, a different question, I think he would say, no, I don't regret stuff at the trade deadline. So is it something he should regret? No, not necessarily. Is it something that would have helped? I think potentially. And then at that point, it's, well, how much? And there's no real predicting that.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that the one guy that many people had them linked to was Luis Castillo, who did make 2 starts, 14 innings, 1.88 ERA. So, obviously that would have been good. But again, I think we can all agree the reason the Dodgers lost was because of the offense and not any other reason. 2 more quotes here that I thought were really, really interesting. The first one, he was asked about the decision not to use Evan Phillips in the 7th inning of Game 4. He basically said, hey, I think you could have made a compelling case either way. It is funny. Like, I like the way he phrases things. He thinks, like, the way he said it was like, some of these are 55-45. And I'm like, hey, that's the type of thing I've been saying. That's kind of what he said. Like, I read between the lines, Matt, as if he was saying, yeah, do I think Phillips probably should have been in that game? Probably. But he was also going to have his managers back and say, how big is the gap between Phillips there versus Almonte there? He hinted at the players that were due up. The situation, some of those things play a factor more than just like who's our best pitcher. But he basically said, yeah, I think either one you could have made a compelling case for. I don't think either of us are surprised he was going to say that. Do you think there was a little bit of like, yeah, would I have used Phillips? Probably. He didn't say that, to be clear. It felt like maybe under the surface he was saying that, though.
Perhaps. I will say that, being there and kind of hearing him say it, that's not how I interpret it in the moment. But I guess, sitting there thinking it through, hearing you say it, like, yeah, I could see where maybe he was implying that. And he's done that in the past where he's, he said, look, like, he's come out and said, I don't always agree with every decision Dave Roberts makes, but it doesn't mean that it was quote unquote bad or wrong, because he is, again, like a lot of these are toss ups, and we discussed that and we agree. I mean, this is one that I would push back most on, just because Evan Phillips had always pretty much been the fireman, and this was sort of the biggest fire of the season. So why aren't you going to him instead of, saving him for a potential 9th inning opportunity that didn't end up mattering anyway? But all that being said, like you and I then came to the conclusion in our last video about this stuff. At the end of the day, it was, 55-45, 52-48, however you want to look at it.
Yeah. All right. Last question here. And this is the one that I'm sure most fans were most excited for, is they were asked Andrew Friedman his thoughts on Dave Roberts. Friedman, as we've hinted at, has made clear Dave Roberts makes 100% of the decisions when it comes to a Yency Almonte versus Evan Phillips. He was agitated in having to repeat that. He feels like every year. To be fair to the person asking, I don't feel like, and maybe it's the reporter's fault out there for not communicating clearly throughout the season, but it feels like he says that once a year at this press conference, and then we all forget about it. And so I didn't think it was an out-of-line question, but if he has truly said it every year, then I'll give him that. But he basically said this was not Dave Roberts' fault when asked whether or not Roberts was to blame, essentially. And he said it was, quote, an organizational failure. I think it's worth pointing out, many of you have probably seen the quote where he says it's an organizational failure. I think it's been, like, wildly taken out of context. He was not doing anything other than saying we are all equally responsible for this. It was not Dave Roberts' fault. It was the organization's fault. He was not saying we suck as an organization. He was just, like, sort of widening the blame, spreading the blame out over Dave Roberts. He said 100% Roberts is back next year. He said he expects the entire coaching staff to be back next year. Obviously, some of those guys will probably get job interviews for managers' positions. But what did you think about this sort of back and forth about was this Dave Roberts' fault, organizational failure, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because he did say, like, he was asked, is the narrative is that Dave Roberts makes, these decisions, and Andrew Friedman came back with, well, whose narrative is that? And he basically said, I feel like it's you guys, like speaking generally to media reporters, like I feel like it's you guys.
He's not wrong. He's not wrong about that.
And, he had, in Friedman's defense, he has said this in the past. I think notably would have to be, I think, 2019. I don't know if it was a talking point last year. But yeah, I mean, that's not surprising. And I'm inclined to agree. However, I don't know. I think he was playing off how much input the front office probably gives Dave Roberts. I think it's very much like when these situations are happening, this is who the numbers say should be in, or this is who we believe should be in, blah, blah. And I think Dave Roberts carries that weight and opinion and then does factor it into his decision. And look, a lot of the times, like, what they're suggesting is the quote unquote right decision. And it's easy to go back and say, well, so and so gave up a run. That was the bad decision, right? But at the time, like, unless you were questioning it sort of in the moment, like, you can't really go back and say, hey, Dave Roberts really messed up there.
Yeah.
But yeah,
and I think some of it is like a sample size thing too, because like take Almonte for an example, like Almonte over Phillips. When you want to do research and give the numbers on the rate of success that Almonte's had, how big of a sample size are you supposed to use? Like, are you supposed to use the entirety of the season? Fair, you could argue it. Are you supposed to use the sample size of since he's come back from injury? Again, I think you can make a compelling case. Or even should you use the sample size of what he has done against the Padres thus far in this series, because he had 5 up, 5 down, and all 5 were via strikeout. So like when you even present the analytics to somebody, if you were going to make the case that the most compelling sample size was, look what Almonte has done the last week, the guy is freaking nails right now, then you can make, you know what I'm saying? Like, so even the idea that Friedman makes a decision, they can make suggestions, but even those suggestions are going to be colored by what you think the sample size is. So sorry I cut you off, but like,
no,
I just think that to believe that any of these decisions are completely black and white, it reveals the bias of what you believe to be the appropriate sample size, what you believe to be, is there a clutch factor? Is the postseason more intense or different, or those types of things?
Yeah, and to your point, then fans want to talk about momentum and hottest seat. Well, then, like, do you look at just what Almonte has done in the NLDS? Because then he would have what you could be described as momentum and the hot hand for a pitcher, right? But yeah, I mean, and then to kind of close it on the organizational failure stuff. Yes, like, I hope there aren't a lot of fans who are looking at that as Friedman saying the Dodgers' entire approach is a failure, because like you explained, it was more of just like there isn't one person to blame. Like, the lineup went cold. Like, even I think he would even put blame on their own preparation and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it was the reaction to just in general, Friedman's press conference hasn't necessarily been surprised. I've seen people calling for him to be fired as well, and just a completely cleaning house, which I mean,
like, if you're that person calling for Andrew Friedman to, like, I need you to use the internets, find the little search bar, and go look at what the Dodgers were like before Andrew Friedman. Like, we take so much for granted that they've won now, 10 divisions in 11 years or something, I believe is the number.
9 and 10.
9 and 10 years. I keep saying it, like, and I'm younger than many people that are watching this and older than some people. The Dodgers did not win a playoff game until I was 16 years old. The idea that we have a president who just put together a team that had one of the greatest regular seasons in the history of baseball, a regular season with a 162-game sample size and not a 4-game sample size, and that people, because of a 4-game failure by the best players in baseball, want to fire the president. I mean, like, my head hurts trying to come to that conclusion, Matt.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, I've sat up here and I've said, like, you could talk me into maybe they need a different voice in Dave Roberts. And I know that's something Friedman addressed, and he said he doesn't believe so, because like, it's not like they won 111 games, had all this success, led in all these different categories, and then got to the playoffs and the players decided, oh, we're actually not going to listen to Dave Roberts anymore, right? Like, and that's certainly fair. But I could be talked into, maybe not so much blaming Dave Roberts, but just he's been here a long time, haven't quite gotten over the hump enough times. Maybe there does need to be a change of voice. Like, I could be willing to hear that argument, but to say that Friedman also needs to go, I mean, I agree with you. He's put together talented rosters year after year, and like we said earlier, it's not what fans want to hear, but the postseason is a little bit of a crapshoot, and there's no specific formula where if you do this, then you absolutely win the World Series. Because guess what? The Dodgers have a very big front office and a talented and a smart front office. And if there was, 1 + 1 = 2 to win a World Series, they would have figured it out by now.
Yeah, who are you rooting for the rest of the way here? I've got Phillies 1, Yankees 2, and then a freaking Grand Canyon sized gap before I have to try and decide whether I'd hate more the Padres or the Astros winning.
Yeah, that's I'm probably in line with that. I mean, the way the playoffs have been going, it's not an ideal situation.
Yeah, yeah. All right, well, that's Matt Moreno. My name is Jeff Spiegel. Again, we appreciate you guys joining us. Andrew Friedman. Some interesting comments. And by the way, you can go watch this press conference. We've got it up on our YouTube page, Dodger Blue 1958. Brandon Gomes, GM, was also there. Again, if you'd like to see what he looks like. You won't really know what his voice sounds like by the end of it, but you'll know what he looks like at least because he was there. So, Matt, we appreciate you. Appreciate you being there, getting us the video, and good conversation. So let us know what you guys thought in the comments below. I'm sure people have lots of thoughts and reactions. And that quote about do we need a different voice, that'll be a video Matt and I will spin out for another time, because I think that's a larger and more interesting conversation. So appreciate you joining us. Check out DodgerBlue.com, DodgerBlue1958 on social media. You can follow Matt on Twitter there. You can follow me on Twitter there as well. As always, go Dodgers.